In the drought-scorched town of Cedar Grove, a desperate widow was about to make a plea that would change everything. What started as a simple walk to Sunday service took a shocking turn when she came face to face with the town's collective cruelty. Adelaide Garrett wasn't your typical beggar. For 12 years, she had spent her life as a devoted farmer's wife, known for her quiet dignity and unwavering work ethic alongside her husband Samuel. When she encountered the congregation asking for nothing more than a chance to earn bread, she had no idea she was walking into a coordinated assault disguised as righteous judgment. Adelaide's desperate request that would lead to brutal violence in broad daylight. What began as a widow's humble plea for work would become a testament to unexpected compassion. The entire community would never be the same after a broken woman found sanctuary in the arms of a grieving rancher who saw her worth when no one else would. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind whistled dry across the scorched hills of Cedar Grove. The sun hung merciless in a bleached sky, casting harsh shadows that offered no refuge from the heat that pressed down like a burial shroud. Adelaide walked the dirt road that led into town, her boots stirring up small clouds of dust with each careful step. Her dress, once a deep blue, had faded to the color of storm clouds, patched and repatched until it resembled more quilt than garment. She carried nothing but a small cloth bundle and the weight of her desperation. The drought had lasted 3 years now, 3 years since the rains had come properly, since the wheat had grown tall and golden, 3 years since her husband Samuel had coughed up blood for the last time and left her alone with nothing but debt and a patch of barren earth that wouldn't yield so much as a withered potato. The bank had taken the house 2 months ago. She'd been living in the ruins of the old Henderson barn ever since, surviving on what little she could scavenge and the charity of those few who still remembered what kindness meant. But kindness was scarce as water in Cedar Grove these days. She paused at the edge of town, steadying herself against a weathered fence post. The church steeple rose before her like an accusing finger, its white paint peeling in long strips that curled in. The heat. Sunday service had ended an hour ago, but she could still see people gathered in small clusters outside the general store, their voices carrying on the still air. Women in their best bonnets, men with their hands tucked deep in their pockets, all of them clean and fed and righteous. Adelaide smoothed her hair back beneath her faded bonnet and walked toward them. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar pain she'd learned to ignore, but today it felt sharper, more insistent. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Mrs. Henley was the first to notice her approach. The woman's face, already pinched with the permanent disapproval she wore like rouge, tightened further. She whispered something to Mrs. Crawford beside her, and soon all their eyes were fixed on Adelaide, with the cold attention of vultures. "Mrs. Garrett," Adelaide said, nodding politely to the banker's wife. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, dried by thirst and pride. "I was wondering, hoping perhaps if anyone might have some work. I'm handy with sewing or cleaning or—" "Work!" Mrs. Garrett's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "And what exactly do you propose to offer in return for honest wages, Mrs. Adelaide? You've no home, no family, nothing but the clothes on your back." The circle of women tightened around her, their faces masks of judgment. Adelaide felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from the sun. "I'm a good worker. I kept house for Samuel for 12 years, raised vegetables, tended chickens." "Had chickens," corrected Mrs. Henley. "Had a garden, had a husband. What you have now is nothing but the charity you've already stretched thin as cotton." Adelaide's hands trembled, but she forced them steady. "I'm only asking for a chance to earn. The voice belonged to Reverend Gerald Ashford, who had emerged from the church like a black crow in his funeral coat, his pale eyes fixed On Adelaide, with the cold intensity of a man who'd found sin walking in broad daylight. What have you done to earn anything, woman? You've brought shame upon this community with your begging, your constant appeals for help, that honest God-fearing. Families should not be expected to provide. The Reverend stepped closer, his shadow falling across Adelaide like a judgment. When your husband died, did you turn to the Lord for guidance? Did you seek honest work, honest marriage to a good man who might provide for you? No, you chose the path of the beggar, the dependent, the burden upon your betters. Adelaide's throat constricted. Reverend, I went to the church first. I asked for help, for guidance. You asked for handouts. His voice cut across hers like a whip. You demanded that the congregation support your idleness, your refusal to accept God's judgment upon your circumstances. A righteous woman would have found another way. What other way? The words burst from her before she could stop them. What other way was there? The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. Mrs. Garrett's mouth formed a thin line of satisfaction. Mrs. Henley actually smiled. Reverend Ashford stepped back as if she'd struck him. There, he said, his voice ringing with triumph. Do you hear the anger, the defiance? This is what happens when we coddle the fallen, when we enable those who refuse to accept their place in God's design. A small crowd had gathered now. Men emerging from the saloon, shopkeepers pausing in their doorways, children peeking around, their mothers' skirts, all of them watching, all of them listening as Reverend Ashford pronounced his verdict. This woman, he announced, his voice carrying across the dusty street, has become a blight upon our community. She refuses honest work, refuses to accept the consequences of her poor choices, and instead demands that we support her in comfort, while good families struggle to feed their own children. Adelaide shook her head, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that she'd sought work everywhere, that no one would hire a woman alone, a woman with no man to vouch for her character, that the few offers she'd received had come with prices she couldn't pay? I never asked for comfort, she whispered. I asked for bread. Bread. Reverend Ashford turned the word over like something distasteful. Bread for a woman who contributes nothing. Bread taken from the mouths of children whose fathers work dawn to dusk in these hard times. He gestured to the crowd that had gathered. Good people, look upon her. See what becomes of those who abandon God's plan for their own selfish desires. The first stone wasn't literal. It was Bart Davis, the blacksmith, who stepped forward with his massive hands clenched into fists. You got some nerve, he said, his voice thick with drink and anger. Coming here again, begging like some worthless cur. Adelaide tried to step back, but the circle had closed around her. Women on one side, men pressing in from the other, all of them united in their judgment. My husband fought beside yours, she said desperately. We were neighbors once. Your husband's dead, Bart said flatly, and maybe that's God's mercy, not having to see what you've become. The blow came without warning, not Bart's fist, but his open palm across her face, the crack of it echoing off the building fronts like a gunshot. Adelaide staggered, her hand flying to her burning cheek. That's for your sass, Bart said. And this... Another blow, harder, sending her to her knees in the dust. This is for your greed. The kicks came next, not from Bart alone, but from others. Men who'd forgotten her name but remembered their anger. Women who held their skirts clear of the dirt as they watched. Children who learned that mercy was weakness and cruelty was justice. Adelaide curled into herself, protecting her head with her arms as boots and fists found their marks. Pain bloomed across her ribs, her shoulders, the tender place where her skull met her neck. She tasted blood and dust and the salt of tears she refused to shed in front of them. Enough. The voice belonged to Clara Sutton, Thomas's late wife's friend, but it came from far away, as if spoken through water. "She's had enough." The blows stopped, but the voices continued. Righteous voices speaking of God's judgment and proper consequences and the dangers of enabling sin. Adelaide lay in the dirt, listening to their certainty, their satisfaction, their absolute conviction that she deserved every moment of what she'd received. When the crowd finally dispersed, when the voices faded and the footsteps receded, Adelaide remained motionless in the dust. The sun beat down on her back, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried its lonesome call. She thought about staying there, about letting the heat and the hurt do what they would, about accepting that perhaps they were right, that she was worthless, that her husband's death had been God's mercy after all. But something deep inside her, some stubborn ember that wouldn't be extinguished, forced her to her hands and knees, forced her to stand, swaying but upright, forced her to walk away from the town with her head held high, despite the blood on her lips and the pain that shot through her ribs with every breath. She walked until the buildings were distant shapes behind her, until the road became a path, and the path became nothing but prairie grass and good intentions. She walked until her legs gave out beneath a cottonwood tree, whose shadow offered the first kindness she'd received all day. And there, finally alone with the wind and the endless sky, Adelaide allowed herself to weep. Not for the pain in her body, which would heal, but for the deeper wounds that might never close. For the knowledge that the world she'd believed in, the community she'd called home, had judged her worthy only of contempt. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when she finally rose and continued walking. She had nowhere to go, no destination in mind, only the need to put distance between herself and the town that had cast her out. The path wound through scrub brush and over small hills, leading her deeper into the empty country where even the buzzards seemed to have given up hope. It was nearly dark when she saw the light. The cabin sat in a hollow between two low hills, barely visible, until Adelaide crested the rise and saw it spreading below her like a picture from a half-remembered dream. Lamplight glowed warm in the windows, and smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still evening air. A small barn leaned against the hillside, and she could make out the shapes of cattle moving slowly in a fenced pasture. Adelaide stopped, swaying slightly on her feet. Pain radiated through her ribs with each breath, and the taste of blood had dried bitter in her mouth. Her dress was torn in 3 places, and dust had turned her dark hair grey. She knew how she must look, like something the wind had worried loose and abandoned. She should keep walking, should not bring her troubles to whatever peace lived in that small circle of light. But her legs trembled with exhaustion, and the darkness pressed close around her with the promise of a cold night ahead. Without shelter, without food, she might not see morning. Adelaide made her way carefully down the slope, her feet sliding in the loose shale. A dog barked once from somewhere near the barn, then fell silent. She could smell wood smoke and something cooking, beans maybe, or stew. Her stomach clenched with desperate hunger. She stopped at the edge of the circle of light that spilled from the windows, suddenly uncertain. What right did she have to disturb this stranger's evening? What reason could she give that wouldn't sound like more begging, more demands upon the charity of others? The door opened before she could decide. A man stepped out onto the narrow porch, tall and lean as fence wire, with dark hair that needed cutting and a week's worth of beard shadowing his jaw. He held a rifle loose in his hands, not exactly threatening but ready, his eyes, pale in the lamplight, fixed on her with the wariness of someone who'd learned that strangers usually brought trouble. "Evening," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You lost?" Adelaide opened her mouth to speak, but only a croak emerged. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm sorry to disturb you, I was wondering if I might trouble you for some water." The man, Thomas, she realized, recognizing him now, despite the months since she'd seen him in town, studied her for a long moment. His gaze took in her torn dress, her bloodied lip, the way she held one arm close against her ribs. Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't name what. "You're hurt," he said. It wasn't a question, but Adelaide nodded anyway. "I had some difficulty in town." Thomas was quiet for so long she began to think he meant to send her away. She couldn't blame him. She was trouble-walking, and any man with sense would bar his door against it. But then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," he said simply. "Carefully now." The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that showed the marks of care. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, and a pot of something that smelled like heaven simmered on the iron stove. Adelaide hadn't realized how cold she'd grown until the warmth hit her, making her shiver despite herself. Thomas set the rifle against the wall and turned to look at her properly in the lamplight. She saw him wince at whatever he found there. "Sit," he said, indicating a chair near the fire. "Let me see what they did to you." Adelaide sank into the chair gratefully, though the movement sent fresh pain shooting through her side. Thomas disappeared through a doorway and returned with a basin of water, clean rags, and a brown bottle that smelled of medicine. He knelt beside her chair, his movements careful and deliberate. "This might sting," he warned, then began cleaning the cut on her lip with gentle precision. Adelaide closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of it. When was the last time someone had touched her with anything but violence or contempt? When had anyone shown her such careful attention? "They did a thorough job," Thomas said quietly, examining the bruises that were already darkening along her jawline. "What did you do to earn their Christian charity?" The bitter edge in his voice surprised her. She opened her eyes to find him watching her with something that might have been understanding. "I asked for help," she said simply. Thomas nodded, as if this explained everything. He soaked a fresh cloth and began cleaning the scrapes on her hands where she'd tried to break her fall. From Reverend Ashford, I'd guess, among others. That man wouldn't recognize true Christianity if it bit him on his righteous backside. Thomas's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Though I suppose that makes him well-suited to leading a congregation that values judgment over mercy." Adelaide studied his face as he worked. She'd seen Thomas in town occasionally over the years, usually buying supplies or selling cattle, but always alone, always quiet. She knew his wife had died of fever 2 winters ago, knew he'd withdrawn even further from the community afterward. What she hadn't known was the depth of bitterness that lined his voice when he spoke of them. "You don't think much of our neighbors," she observed. Thomas paused in his ministrations, meeting her eyes directly. "Our neighbors watched you get beaten in the street and did nothing to stop it. What exactly should I think of them?" The simple condemnation in his voice was more comforting than any platitude about God's plan or the necessity of accepting one's lot. Here was someone who saw the world as clearly as she did, who recognized cruelty for what it was, regardless of the righteousness it wore as camouflage. "The cut on your lip isn't deep," Thomas continued, returning to his careful work, "but you might have cracked a rib, the way you're holding yourself." It's not the first time," Adelaide said, then immediately regretted the admission. Thomas's hands stilled. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose it is." He finished cleaning her wounds in silence, then rose and ladled soup from the pot into a wooden bowl. The smell made Adelaide's mouth water despite her swollen lip. "Eat," he said, setting the bowl in her hands along with a piece of bread that was only slightly stale. "Slowly now. Don't make yourself sick." Adelaide wanted to devour the food, to fill the hollow ache that had been her constant companion for days. But she forced herself to take small, careful spoonfuls, savoring each one. The soup was simple, beans and vegetables with a little salt pork, but it tasted like salvation. Thomas sat across from her, watching the fire rather than her face, giving her privacy to eat, to compose herself, to decide what came next. "I can't pay you," Adelaide said finally, when the bowl was empty and warmth had begun to spread through her chest. "Did I ask for payment?" "No, but—" she gestured helplessly. "I have nothing to offer in return." Thomas looked at her then, his pale eyes serious. "Sometimes help is just help. No strings, no expectations, no debt incurred. Sometimes one person helps another because it's the right thing to do." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back. She'd forgotten that such people existed, had begun to believe that every kindness came with a price, that generosity was always conditional. "You can sleep here tonight," Thomas continued, as if he hadn't just offered her a miracle. "Tomorrow we'll see about getting you somewhere safe." "There is nowhere safe," Adelaide said quietly. "Not for someone like me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering this. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending smoke back down the chimney in little puffs. "Then I suppose you'll have to stay until we figure something out," he said finally. Adelaide stared at him. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." Thomas stood and added wood to the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "I know you've been hurt and you need help, and you've got nowhere else to go. That's all I need to know." He showed her to a small room off the main cabin, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. The sheets were clean but old, patched in places and worn soft with use. This was... Thomas paused in the doorway. This was going to be the nursery. Mary and I, we thought, well, it doesn't matter now. Adelaide touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry." Thomas nodded once, then stepped back. "Sleep well. If you need anything, I'll be just outside." He closed the door softly, leaving Adelaide alone with the luxury of privacy, of safety, of walls that would keep the world at bay for at least one night. She sank onto the bed, hardly daring to believe her good fortune. Through the thin wall, she could hear Thomas moving about the cabin, banking the fire, settling in for the night. The sounds were domestic, comforting, normal in a way her life hadn't been for months. Adelaide lay down fully clothed, too tired to worry about proprieties or what tomorrow might bring. For the first time since Samuel's death, she fell asleep, feeling protected rather than hunted, warm rather than cold, valued rather than worthless. She didn't know then that Thomas lay awake most of the night, listening for sounds of distress from her room, wondering what he'd gotten himself into by offering shelter to a woman the entire town had marked as trouble. She didn't know that he'd recognized something of his own pain in her eyes, his own exile in her circumstances. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't alone. Adelaide woke to the sound of someone chopping wood, the steady rhythm of axe against log carrying through the thin walls of the cabin. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, by the absence of wind through the broken boards she'd grown accustomed to in the old barn. Then memory returned, and with it a careful gratitude that felt fragile as spun glass. She sat up slowly, testing her body's complaints. Her ribs ached, but no longer sent lightning through. Her chest with each breath. The cut on her lip had closed, though it remained tender to the touch. She was stiff and sore, but she was healing. Pale morning light filtered through the small window, revealing details the lamplight had hidden. The room was simple but carefully made, with joints that fit tight and boards that lay smooth under the whitewash. Someone had carved small flowers into the windowsill, delicate work that spoke of hope for the future this room was meant to hold. Adelaide rose and smoothed her dress as best she could, knowing she looked like something the cat had dragged in, but lacking the means to improve matters. She opened the door cautiously and stepped into the main room. Thomas had been busy. The fire burned bright and steady, coffee boiled on the stove, and the smell of frying bacon made her mouth water. He looked up from the skillet as she entered, taking in her careful movements with an assessing eye. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Better," Adelaide said, and meant it. "Much better, thank you." Thomas nodded and turned back to the stove. "Coffee's ready if you want some. Bacon's almost done." Adelaide poured herself coffee from the pot, wrapping her hands around the tin cup to warm them. The liquid was strong and bitter and perfect. "You don't have to feed me," she said. "I don't have to do anything," Thomas replied, dividing the bacon between two plates. "But I'm going to anyway." They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger through the windows. Adelaide tried not to wolf down the food, tried to maintain some semblance of manners, but she was desperately hungry, and Thomas seemed to understand. He kept refilling her plate until she finally had to refuse, too full to take another bite. "I should go," Adelaide said finally, though the words felt like stones in her throat. Thomas looked at her steadily. "Where?" It was a simple question with no good answer. Adelaide stared into her coffee cup, searching for options that didn't exist. "I don't know. Somewhere." "Somewhere isn't a place," Thomas said. "It's just an idea people use when they don't want to face facts." "What facts?" "That you've got nowhere to go. That if I turn you out now, you'll likely be dead inside a week. That this town has marked you as something to be destroyed, and they won't rest until they've finished the job." Adelaide flinched at his bluntness, but she couldn't argue with it. "So what do you suggest?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the hills beyond. "I suggest you stay," he said finally, "until you're healed up proper. Until we can figure out something better. I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely." "Why not?" Thomas's question was genuinely curious. "What else have I got to do with my time? What other use is there for this place?" Adelaide looked around the cabin, seeing it properly for the first time. It was well built and comfortable, but it felt hollow somehow, like a house where voices had been silenced. "This was your home, yours and your wife's." "Was," Thomas. "Agreed. Now it's just a place where I eat and sleep and wait for something to change. Might as well be a place where two people do those things instead of one." The offer hung between them like a bridge half-built, requiring a leap of faith to cross. Adelaide studied Thomas's face, searching for hidden motives, for the catch that experience had taught her always existed. But she found only a quiet sincerity that was somehow harder to accept than any ulterior motive would have been. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I could be anyone. I could be trouble." And Thomas almost smiled at that. "Lady, you're already trouble. The question is whether you're the kind of trouble worth having around." Over the following days, they settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Thomas went about his daily work, tending his small herd of cattle, repairing fence, chopping wood for winter, while Adelaide recovered her strength and tried to make herself useful around the cabin. She cooked when Thomas would let her, mended clothes that had been too long neglected, cleaned corners that hadn't seen attention since Mary's death. At first they spoke little, circling each other like wary animals, unsure of the other's intentions. But gradually, in the way of people thrown together by circumstance, they began to share pieces of themselves. Adelaide learned that Thomas had been married for 8 years when Mary died, that they'd tried unsuccessfully for children, that her death had left him so broken he'd barely spoken to another human being for months. She learned that he'd been born on this land, that his father had built the cabin with his own hands, that Thomas had never wanted to be anywhere else. Thomas learned that Adelaide had grown up in Missouri, that she'd met Samuel at a church social, and followed him west, full of dreams about farming and family. He learned that they'd lost 2 babies before they were born, that Samuel had died slowly and painfully, coughing up his life one bloody spoonful at a time. He learned that she'd held on to the farm for 6 months after the funeral, fighting the bank and the drought and her own despair until she'd finally lost everything. They shared these stories in fragments, between tasks and over meals, never dwelling too long on the pain, but acknowledging it the way one acknowledges scars, as proof of survival rather than evidence of failure. "Show me how to shoot, Adelaide," said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. Thomas looked at her with surprise. "Shoot what?" "Whatever needs shooting. Coyotes, snakes, men who won't take no for an answer." There was steel in her voice that hadn't been there when she'd first stumbled into his light, and Thomas recognized it for what it was, the hardening that came from being broken and choosing to forge yourself back together stronger than before. "Tomorrow," he promised. "I'll teach you tomorrow." He was as good as his word. The next morning he led her to a cleared area behind the barn and set up targets made from old cans and pieces of scrap wood. The rifle felt heavy and foreign in Adelaide's hands, but Thomas was a patient teacher, adjusting her stance, showing her how to sight down the barrel, explaining the squeeze of the trigger. Her first shots went wide, kicking up dust in the distance, but Adelaide was stubborn, and pain had taught her focus. By the end of the afternoon, she was hitting the targets more often than not, the rifle beginning to feel like an extension of her will, rather than an unruly tool. "Good," Thomas said as she placed 3 shots in a row through the center of an old tomato can. "Real good." Adelaide lowered the rifle, feeling a satisfaction that went deeper than mere marksmanship. For the first time since Samuel's death, she felt capable of protecting herself, of being something other than a victim waiting for rescue or destruction. "Thank you," she said. Thomas nodded, understanding that she meant more than just the shooting lessons. "Come on, let's see if you remember how to make cornbread." They walked back to the cabin together as the light faded, comfortable in each other's company in a way that would have seemed impossible just days before. Adelaide realized with something like surprise that she was happy, not the wild joy of unexpected good fortune, but the quiet contentment of work well done and companionship freely given. That night, as she lay in the small room that had begun to feel like home, Adelaide allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. She thought about the way Thomas's face had looked when she'd hit the targets, about the careful way he'd tended her wounds, about the gradual thawing of the grief that had held him frozen for so long. She thought about the town that had cast her out, about the judgment and cruelty and righteousness that wore the mask of morality. And for the first time, she felt something other than pain when she remembered it. She felt pity for people so afraid of their own vulnerability that they had to destroy it whenever they saw it in others. In the main room, Thomas sat by the dying fire, listening to the wind in the eaves and the sound of Adelaide's quiet breathing through the thin wall. He thought about Mary, about the guilt he'd carried since her death, about the way grief had narrowed his world to the size of his own suffering. But grief, he was learning, was not the only legacy the dead could leave. There was also compassion, learned through loss. There was also the understanding that came from having been broken and slowly put back together by time and unexpected kindness. He thought about Adelaide's determination as she'd learned to shoot, about the way she'd quietly taken on the work of caring for his home, about the gradual return of laughter to a place where it had been absent too long. Tomorrow, there would be cattle to tend and fences to mend. There would be the constant awareness that the town beyond the hills remained hostile, that safety was temporary and fragile. But tonight there was warmth and companionship and the possibility that healing might be something they could accomplish together. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of rain still days away. And in the small cabin nestled between the hills, 2 people who had lost everything slowly began to build something new from the pieces they had left. The days at Thomas's ranch had taken on a rhythm that felt almost normal, almost safe. Adelaide had grown stronger, her bruises fading to yellow shadows, her confidence returning with each successful shot at the tin cans behind the barn. She'd learned to milk Thomas's 2 cows, to gather eggs from the handful of chickens that scratched in the dirt yard, to cook meals that didn't taste like desperation. For 3 weeks, she'd allowed herself to believe that perhaps the world could be a place where kindness existed without conditions. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday morning when Sarah Monroe came riding up the path with a basket balanced across her saddle and fear written plain across her young face. Adelaide was hanging laundry on the line Thomas had strung between 2 cottonwood trees when she heard the hoofbeats, her hands stilled on the wet fabric, muscles tensing with the instinct of a hunted animal. Through the months since Samuel's death, unexpected visitors had never brought good news. Sarah dismounted near the porch, her movements quick and nervous. She was perhaps 19, with honey-colored hair and the kind of fresh-faced beauty that spoke of enough food and a father who could protect what was his. Adelaide had seen her in town before the beating, always quiet, always watching with curious eyes that seemed kinder than most. Thomas emerged from the barn, his expression wary. He'd grown protective of their small peace, Adelaide realized, as cautious as she was about anything that might threaten it. "Miss Monroe," he said politely, touching the brim of his hat. "What brings you out this way?" Sarah's eyes darted between Thomas and Adelaide, uncertainty flickering across her features. I brought some things." She lifted the basket from her saddle. "Bread some preserves my mother made, a little salt pork." Adelaide felt heat rise in her cheeks. More charity, more pity from people who saw her as a burden to be managed rather than a person deserving of dignity. She started to turn away, but Sarah's next words stopped her. "It's not charity," the girl said quietly. "It's an apology." Thomas stepped closer, his voice careful. "Apology for what?" Sarah looked directly at Adelaide now, her young face serious beyond her years. "For what happened in town. For what we let happen. For what we—" She swallowed hard. "For what we watched and did nothing to stop." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. Adelaide found she couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe around the sudden tightness in her chest. "Most folks," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, "most folks think you got what you deserved. They think Reverend Ashford was right, that you were, that you brought shame on the town." She paused, struggling with the words. "But I was there. I saw what really happened, and it wasn't right." Thomas had gone very still, his pale eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her shift nervously. "What exactly did you see?" "I saw a woman asking for help. I saw people who call themselves Christians turn their backs on someone in need, and I saw men use their fists on someone who couldn't fight back." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "It wasn't righteous. It was just cruel." Adelaide sank onto the porch step, overwhelmed by the simple acknowledgement of truth. For weeks, she'd wondered if she'd imagined the injustice, if perhaps she really had deserved what they'd done to her. To hear someone else name it for what it was felt like absolution. "That's kind of you to say," she managed. "It's not kind. It's just true." Sarah set the basket on the ground and looked around the ranch with curious eyes. "You're safe here." "For now," Thomas answered before Adelaide could speak. There was something in his tone that made Sarah look at him more sharply. "What do you mean, for now?" Thomas and Adelaide exchanged glances. They'd both been avoiding this question, this acknowledgement that their small sanctuary existed only as long as the outside world chose to ignore it. "The town knows where I am," Adelaide said quietly. "They'll know I'm here." Sarah nodded slowly. "They do know. Some of them, anyway." She glanced around nervously, as if expecting to see hostile faces emerge from behind the trees. "That's Part of why I came, to warn you. Adelaide's blood turned cold. Warn us about what? Reverend Ashford's been preaching against you. Not by name exactly, but everyone knows who he means. He says you're a corrupting influence, that your situation threatens the moral fabric of the community. Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment at repeating such words. He says good Christian men shouldn't associate with fallen women, that it reflects poorly on their character and judgment. Thomas's jaw tightened. And what do the good Christian men think about that? Some agree with him, Bart Davis especially. He's been talking about how you're harboring a woman of questionable virtue. Says it's not right, a man living alone with a woman he's not married to. Adelaide felt sick. She'd known this moment would come, had felt it lurking at the edges of their fragile peace, like a wolf waiting for the right moment to strike. But knowing and facing the reality were different things entirely. What else? Thomas asked, his voice deadly quiet. Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the role of messenger. There's talk of coming out here, of making sure you understand the position you're putting yourself in by harboring her. Harboring, Thomas repeated, the word sharp as broken glass, like she's some kind of criminal. To them, she might as well be. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. They think she's dangerous, not physically, but morally. They think she'll corrupt you, drag you down with her. Adelaide stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. The open prairie stretched before her, vast and empty, and offering no refuge from the judgment that followed her like a shadow. I should go, she said. I should leave before they come here, before they make trouble for you. No. Thomas's voice was flat, final. You're not going anywhere. Thomas, you don't understand. They'll make your life hell. They'll what? He turned to face her, his pale eyes blazing with an anger she'd never seen before. Refuse to do business with me? I barely trade with them anyway. Spread rumors about my character? My character's been questionable since Mary died and I stopped. Pretending to care about their opinions. Turn me out of their church? I haven't set foot in that building since Ashford refused to let Mary be buried in consecrated ground because she died of fever instead of living to a ripe old age like a proper Christian woman. Adelaide stared at him. He did what? Said fever was God's judgment. Said burying her with the righteous would be an insult to those who'd lived according to his plan. Thomas's voice was bitter as wormwood. I buried her myself, up on the hill behind the house where she can look out, over the land she loved, and I decided that day that Reverend Gerald Ashford and his congregation could go straight to hell for all I cared. Sarah looked shocked by this revelation, as if she'd stumbled into something far deeper than she'd intended. I didn't know, she whispered. Most people don't. They prefer the version where the grieving widower simply withdrew from society, rather than the version where society cast him out for refusing to accept their judgment of his wife's worthiness. Thomas's gaze returned to Adelaide. So you see, I was already marked as trouble long before you arrived. The only difference is that now I have company in my exile. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of self-pity, but something deeper. Gratitude mixed with grief for all the cruelty the world seemed determined to inflict on those who dared to love without permission, to grieve without apology, to need help without shame. There's something else, Sarah said reluctantly. Something I heard my father talking about with Mr. Garrett at the bank. Thomas and Adelaide both turned toward her, sensing from her tone that this news would be worse than what had come before. There are soldiers coming through, federal troops, looking for someone. A deserter, they said, someone who shot an officer and stole government property. Sarah's voice dropped even lower. They're asking questions about strangers, about anyone. Knew who might have come through the area recently. Adelaide's world tilted. What kind of deserter? I don't know the details, but they're offering a reward for information, a substantial one. Sarah looked between them with worry. Bart Davis has been talking about how there might be more to your story than meets the eye, Mrs. Adelaide. How maybe you're not just a poor widow, but something more dangerous. The implications hit Adelaide like a physical blow. Bad enough to be marked as a moral threat, but if the town decided she might be connected to military criminals, if they thought there was money to be made by turning her in. How long? Thomas asked. How long before the soldiers arrive? They're already here, Sarah said quietly. Camped just outside town. They plan to start questioning people tomorrow. Adelaide closed her eyes, feeling the walls of their sanctuary crumble around her. 3 weeks of peace, of healing, of slowly learning to trust again, and now it was over. Now she was back to being hunted, back to being alone, back to running with nowhere to run to. I have to leave, she said again. Tonight. Now. Before. They come here asking questions. And go where? Thomas's voice was gentle but implacable. You think running will make you look less guilty of whatever they suspect you of? You think disappearing will convince them you're innocent? I think staying will get you killed. Adelaide opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. They'll come here. They'll find me. And when they do, they'll assume you were helping me hide whatever crimes they think I've committed. Maybe I was, Thomas said quietly. Maybe hiding from injustice isn't a crime, no matter who decides to call it one. Sarah looked between them with growing alarm. You can't fight the army. You can't fight the whole town. If they decide you're both criminals, then we'll face whatever comes together, Thomas said simply. That's what people do when they care about each other. They don't run at the first sign of trouble. They stand together and weather whatever storm comes their way. Adelaide stared at him, overwhelmed by the quiet certainty in his voice. How long had it been since someone had chosen to stand with her rather than against her? How long since someone had looked at her troubles and seen them as shared burdens rather than reasons to flee? Thomas, she whispered, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. He stepped closer, his pale eyes serious as death. I'm saying that whatever you were before you came here doesn't matter. Whatever they think you've done doesn't matter. What matters is who you are now, in this moment, and the person I've come to know is worth protecting. Sarah cleared her throat nervously. I should go, if someone sees me here too long. She remounted her horse, then paused to look back. At them. Be careful, both of you, and if you need anything, if anything at all, you can find me at the old Henderson barn on Thursday afternoons. I help my father check on the cattle there. She rode away quickly, leaving Thomas and Adelaide alone with the weight of approaching danger and the terrible choice it demanded. Stay and fight an unwinnable battle, or run and lose the only peace either of them had known in years. Adelaide sank back onto the porch step, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it all. What are we going to do? Thomas sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the cooling afternoon air. We're going to do what we've been doing. We're going to take care of each other and trust that somehow that'll be enough. And if it's not? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the prairie. Then at least we'll face whatever comes with our heads held high and our consciences clear. That's more than most people manage. Adelaide leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steady presence. Tomorrow the soldiers would come. Tomorrow their small world might shatter completely. But tonight they still had this moment, this choice to stand together against whatever storms might come. It would have to be enough. The soldiers arrived at dawn on Thursday, their blue uniforms stark against the pale sky, as they rode into Cedar Grove with the authority of men accustomed to being obeyed. Adelaide watched them from the hill behind Thomas's cabin, lying flat among the scrub brush with Thomas's field glasses pressed to her eyes. 6 men, led by a captain, whose bearing spoke of career military and little patience for civilian complications. She'd been watching the town since before first light, unable to sleep for the dread that sat heavy in her chest like a stone. Thomas had tried to convince her to stay in the cabin, to let him handle whatever questions might come, but Adelaide had refused. If she was going to be hunted, she wanted to see her hunters coming. "What do you see?" Thomas asked quietly. He lay beside her in the brush, his rifle within easy reach, though they both knew 6 trained soldiers were beyond the reach of any resistance they might offer. "They're setting up in front of the church," Adelaide murmured, adjusting the focus of the glasses. "Looks like they're planning to question people one by one." Through the lenses, she could see townspeople beginning to gather in the dusty street, drawn by curiosity and the kind of excitement that came with anything that broke the monotony of their hard lives. Reverend Ashford emerged from the church, his black coat making him look like a carrion bird among the crowd. "Can you hear what they're saying?" Adelaide strained to listen, but the wind carried only fragments of voices, indistinct murmurs. That might have been anything. She shook her head and handed Thomas the glasses. He studied the scene below for several minutes, his expression growing grimmer with each passing moment. "They're being very thorough," he said finally. "Looks like they're asking everyone the same questions, taking notes on the answers. Questions about me. Questions about strangers. About anyone who might have passed through recently, anyone who might be hiding something." Thomas lowered the glasses and looked at her directly. "Adelaide, is there anything you need to tell me, anything about your past that might explain why they're here?" The question hung between them like a blade. Adelaide felt the weight of all the trust they'd built over the past weeks, all the careful intimacy of shared meals and quiet conversations, and the slow healing of wounded hearts. How could she explain that she'd told him everything that mattered, that whatever crimes the soldiers thought they were chasing, she was guilty of nothing more than surviving in a world that seemed determined to punish her for existing? "I've never seen those men before in my life," she said quietly. "I've never stolen from the government, never harbored criminals, never done anything that would bring federal troops to a place like this." Thomas nodded, accepting her words without question. Then they're chasing shadows, or someone's fed them false information to collect a reward. "Bart Davis," Adelaide said with sudden certainty. "Sarah said he's been talking about me, about how there might be more to my story, if there's money involved. Bart's stupid enough to make up lies if he thinks it'll profit him." Thomas raised the glasses again, scanning the crowd below. "But he's also coward enough to run if his lies get challenged." They watched in tense silence as the soldiers worked their way through the townspeople, questioning each person systematically. Adelaide recognized most of the faces even at this distance. Mrs. Henley, with her perpetual disapproval, Mr. Talbot from the general store, the Dawson family who farmed the land just east of town. All of them answering questions about her, all of them probably eager to share whatever gossip and speculation had grown up around her name. "There," Thomas said suddenly, his voice tight. "Look." Adelaide took the glasses and focused on the group near the church steps. Bart Davis stood before the captain, gesturing animatedly, his face flushed with the excitement of someone who finally had an audience for his grievances. Even at this distance, Adelaide could see the soldier taking careful notes as Bart spoke. "He's telling them about me," she whispered. "He's telling them something. Whether it's truth or fiction remains to be seen." They watched as Bart continued his animated conversation with the captain, occasionally pointing in the direction of Thomas's ranch. Other townspeople gathered around, adding their own comments, their own observations and suspicions. Adelaide felt sick watching it. seeing how eager they were to throw her to the wolves if it meant protecting themselves or earning a reward. "I should run," she said, for what felt like the 100th time since Sarah's warning. "I should take a horse and ride as far and fast as I can before they come here." "Running makes you look guilty," Thomas replied, his voice maddeningly calm. "And besides, where would you go? They're federal troops, not local deputies. They have resources you can't outrun." "Then what do you suggest?" Thomas lowered the glasses and looked at her with the steady gaze that had become so familiar, so comforting over the past weeks. "I suggest we go down there and face whatever accusations they're making, together." Adelaide stared at him. "Are you insane? If we walk into town now, they'll arrest us both on the spot." "Maybe. Or maybe they'll realize they're chasing ghosts and move on to wherever the real criminal has gone." Thomas began moving back toward the horses they'd left hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. "Either way, hiding up here won't solve anything. It'll just make us look guilty of whatever they think we've done." Adelaide grabbed his arm. "Thomas, listen to me. These aren't reasonable men looking for truth. These are soldiers following orders, looking for someone to blame for whatever crime they're investigating. If they decide I'm their suspect, they won't care about evidence or testimony or anything else." Thomas stopped and turned to face her fully. "Then we'll make them care. We'll force them to look at the facts instead of the convenient story Bart Davis is probably spinning." "And how exactly do we do that?" "By walking into that town with our heads held high and demanding to know what we're being accused of. By making them state their case publicly, in front of witnesses, instead of letting them base their decisions on gossip and speculation." Thomas's pale eyes blazed with determination. "By refusing to be treated like criminals when we've done nothing wrong." Adelaide felt torn between admiration for his courage and terror at what it might cost them both. "They could kill us." "They could, but they're more likely to kill us if we run, and they have to hunt us down like fugitives." Thomas reached out and took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "Adelaide, we've spent weeks building something. Good here, something worth protecting. I won't let fear destroy that without a fight." She looked into his face and saw not just determination but something deeper. Love, perhaps, or at least the kind of loyalty that transcended rational self-interest. When had anyone ever been willing to risk so much for her sake? "If we do this," she said quietly, "if we walk down there and face them, there's no guarantee we'll walk back out." "No," Thomas agreed. "There's no guarantee of anything, but at least we'll face whatever comes together instead of spending the rest of our lives running from shadows." Adelaide closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Everything in her screamed to run, to flee into the empty prairie, and trust to luck and desperation to keep her alive. But Thomas was right. Running would only delay the inevitable, and it would mean abandoning the first real home she'd known since Samuel's death. "All right," she said finally, "but we do this my way. We don't go in like lambs to slaughter. We go in smart, with a plan." Thomas smiled for the first time since the soldiers had appeared. "What did you have in mind?" Adelaide opened her eyes and looked down at the town spread below them, at the cluster of blue uniforms and the gathering crowd of her former neighbors. Fear still coiled in her stomach like a living thing, but alongside it was something else. Anger, perhaps, or simply the stubborn refusal to be broken that had carried her through every other trial life had thrown at her. "We go in separately," she said. "You first, like you're just coming to town on business. Let them question you. Let them hear your answers. Then I come in later, like I'm turning myself in voluntarily, like I have nothing to hide. That puts all the risk on you. The risk is already on me. This way, at least you have a chance to establish that you're not harboring a criminal, just helping a neighbor in need." Thomas considered this, clearly unhappy with any plan that involved Adelaide facing danger alone. And if they arrest you on the spot, then you'll know where I am, and maybe you can do something to help. But if we go in together, they'll assume we're conspirators and arrest us both. It wasn't a perfect plan. It wasn't even a good plan. But it was better than hiding in the brush until the soldiers came to drag them out. Better than running until exhaustion or bullets brought them down. 1 hour, Thomas said finally. I'll go in first. Let them ask their questions. 1 hour later, you follow. If something goes wrong, you get on your horse and ride as far from here as you can. Adelaide squeezed his hands tightly. Promise me that, whatever happens to me, you don't throw your life away trying to save mine. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with words he clearly didn't want to say. I promise, he said finally, though they both knew it was a lie. They made their way back to the cabin in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the next few hours might bring. Adelaide changed into her best dress, the one she'd been wearing when she first came to Thomas's door, now cleaned and mended until it looked almost respectable. She braided her hair carefully and pinned it up, trying to look like a woman with nothing to hide rather than a fugitive preparing for capture. Thomas cleaned his rifle and checked his sidearm, though they both knew weapons would be useless against 6 trained soldiers. It was a ritual more than a preparation, a way of asserting some measure of control over circumstances that had already spiraled beyond their influence. Whatever happens, Adelaide said as they stood together on the porch, watching the sun climb higher toward noon, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest I've known since Samuel died. Maybe the happiest I've ever known. Thomas pulled her close, holding her tight against his chest, as if he could shield her from whatever was coming through the sheer force of his will. This isn't goodbye, he said fiercely. This is just temporary setback. We'll get through this, and then we'll come home and go back to building the life we started here. Adelaide wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the stubborn optimism that had carried him through his own losses and somehow given him strength enough to share with her. But she'd learned too much about the world's capacity for cruelty to believe that wanting something was enough to make it happen. Still, she held him close and let herself imagine, for just a moment, that love might be stronger than fear, that truth might triumph over convenient lies, that two people who'd found each other in the darkness might somehow find their way back. To the light, it would have to be enough hope to carry them through whatever came next. Thomas rode into Cedar Grove with the steady pace of a man who had legitimate business and nothing to hide. Adelaide watched him from the hilltop until he disappeared among the buildings, then began counting the minutes until her own moment of reckoning would arrive. The sun climbed higher, casting short shadows that offered no relief from the heat or the tension that wound tighter in her chest with each passing moment. In the town below, she could see the soldiers had established a makeshift headquarters. In front of the church, with a table and chairs set up where the captain could conduct his interviews with military efficiency. A small crowd of townspeople lingered nearby, drawn by the excitement of federal troops and the promise of drama unfolding in their quiet settlement. Through Thomas's field glasses, Adelaide watched him approach the soldiers' station with the casual confidence of a man who belonged there. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see him gesturing toward his ranch, answering questions with what appeared to be calm honesty. The captain made notes, asked follow-up questions, consulted with his subordinates. After perhaps 20 minutes, Thomas shook hands with the captain and walked toward the general store, playing his part as a rancher conducting ordinary business in town. But Adelaide noticed the way his shoulders held tension, the careful way he moved as if expecting trouble at any moment. She was so focused on watching Thomas that she almost missed the commotion that erupted near the church. Raised voices carried up the hill, and through the glasses she could see Bart Davis gesticulating wildly, pointing repeatedly toward Thomas's ranch, while the captain listened with growing attention. Adelaide's blood ran cold as she recognized the scene playing out below. Bart wasn't just sharing gossip, he was making formal accusations, providing the soldiers with the kind of specific information that could transform speculation into action. She watched the captain issue rapid orders to his men, saw 2 soldiers mount their horses and begin riding in the direction of Thomas's ranch. The plan was falling apart before it had properly begun. Adelaide scrambled down the hillside toward the hidden horses, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. She could flee now, try to outrun the soldiers who were heading to search Thomas's cabin. She could ride into town immediately and try to intercept whatever story Bart was telling before it gained more credibility. Or she could stick to the original. Plan and hope that Thomas could handle whatever accusations were being made. None of the choices seemed likely to end well. She was still wrestling with the decision when she heard hoofbeats approaching along the path that led to the ranch. Adelaide threw herself behind a boulder, pressing flat against the stone as 2 soldiers rode past at a steady trot. Their faces were grim with purpose, and she caught fragments of their conversation as they passed. Search the buildings thoroughly. Captain wants any evidence of... If the woman's there, bring her back alive. Adelaide's heart hammered against her ribs as the implications sank in. They weren't just coming to ask questions, they were coming to arrest her, based on whatever lies Bart Davis had told them. And if they found evidence she'd been staying. At Thomas's ranch, they'd arrest him too for harboring a fugitive. She had to warn him, had to find a way to get word to Thomas before the soldiers returned to town with proof of her presence at his cabin. But how could she reach him without exposing herself to capture? The answer came to her as she remembered Sarah Monroe's offer of help, her promise to be at the old Henderson barn on Thursday afternoons. It was Thursday, and if Sarah was true to her word, Adelaide might have an ally who could carry a warning. To Thomas. Adelaide mounted her horse and rode hard across the open prairie, staying low and using every fold in the terrain to avoid being seen from the town or the main road. The old Henderson barn sat in a hollow about 2 miles north of Cedar Grove, its weathered boards and sagging roof marking it as one of the casualties of the drought years. She found Sarah there as promised, checking the water level in a stock tank while her horse grazed nearby. The young woman looked up as Adelaide approached, her face shifting from surprise to alarm as she took in Adelaide's obvious distress. "Mrs. Adelaide, what are you doing here? The soldiers—" "I know about the soldiers." Adelaide dismounted quickly, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. "They've sent men to search Thomas's ranch. Bart Davis has been filling their heads with lies, and now they think I'm some kind of criminal. I need you to get word to Thomas, warn him before they come back to town." Sarah's face went pale. "What kind of lies?" "I don't know exactly, but it's serious enough that they're treating me as a fugitive. They're searching his cabin right now, looking for evidence that I've been staying there." "But you have been." "Staying there?" Sarah said, confused. "Yes, but not for the reasons they think. Not because I'm a criminal, but because I had nowhere else to go." Adelaide paced beside her horse, too agitated to stand still. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Whatever Bart Davis has told them, whatever crimes they think I've committed, none of it is true. I'm exactly what I appear to be, a widow trying to survive in a world that's decided I don't deserve compassion." Sarah studied Adelaide's face with the careful attention of someone trying to discern truth from deception. "Then why are federal troops looking for you?" "I don't know. Maybe there's another woman who fits my description. Maybe Bart made up a story about government property or desertion to collect a reward. Maybe they're just so desperate to find someone to blame for whatever crime they're investigating that they're willing to arrest anyone who seems convenient." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Both women turned to see a rider cresting the hill, Thomas pushing his horse hard and looking grim as death. He spotted them and changed course, arriving at the barn in a cloud of dust and barely controlled panic. "Adelaide, thank God," he said, swinging down from his saddle. "I saw the soldiers heading toward the ranch and came looking for you." "What did they ask you?" Adelaide demanded. "What did you tell them?" "They asked about strangers, about anyone who might have passed through recently. I told them the truth, that I'd helped a neighbor in need, that you'd been recovering from injuries sustained in town." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing in agitated spikes. But then Bart started talking, and everything changed. "What did he say?" "He told them you were the woman they're looking for, said you'd confessed to him about shooting an army officer, about stealing government documents and gold. Said you'd been bragging about how you'd fooled everyone into thinking you were just a poor widow, when you were really a dangerous criminal." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. "That's completely false. I've never even spoken to Bart Davis except to ask for work, and he turned me away with curses. I know that, and you know that, but the soldiers don't." And Bart was very convincing, very detailed in his accusations. He even produced what he claimed was evidence. A locket he said you'd tried to sell him, one that supposedly belonged to the officer's wife. Sarah gasped. "The locket! But that's—" "What?" Thomas turned toward her sharply. "You know something about a locket." Sarah's face had gone white as fresh snow. "The locket Bart mentioned. I know where he got it, and it wasn't from Mrs. Adelaide." She looked between them with growing horror. "My mother lost her locket 3 months ago. She thought she'd dropped it somewhere in town, but we never found it. It was her grandmother's, with her initials engraved inside." The implications hit them all at the same moment. Bart hadn't just lied about Adelaide's supposed confessions. He'd planted evidence to support his story, using a stolen locket to frame her for crimes she'd never committed. "He set me up," Adelaide whispered. "He deliberately tried to get me arrested for something I didn't do." "But why?" Sarah asked. "Why would he do such a thing?" Thomas's expression had turned darker than a prairie storm. "Because he's always hated Adelaide's family, because he wanted her husband's land when Samuel died and was furious when the bank got it instead, because he's the kind of man who'd rather destroy someone than admit he was wrong about them." Adelaide sank onto a fallen log, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Bart's betrayal. It was one thing to be shunned and beaten for asking for help. It was another entirely to be framed for federal crimes by someone who decided she deserved to hang. "What do we do now?" she asked. "How do we prove that the locket isn't mine, that Bart's story is false?" Sarah stepped forward, her young face set with determination that reminded Adelaide of her own stubborn refusal to surrender. "We tell the truth. We go to the soldiers and explain exactly what happened, exactly where that locket came from." "And you think they'll believe us over Bart?" Thomas asked. "He's a respected member of the community, a man with property and standing. We're the town pariah and the hermit who's been protecting her." "Then we make them believe us," Sarah said fiercely. "We bring proof. My mother can identify her locket, can show them the initials that match her grandmother's name, not some dead officer's wife. We can prove that Bart stole it and used it to frame Mrs. Adelaide." Adelaide looked at the young woman with something approaching awe. Here was someone barely out of childhood, willing to risk her family's standing and her own safety to defend a woman the entire town had written off as worthless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Sarah," she said gently, "if you stand up for me publicly, if you contradict Bart's story in front of the soldiers, it will make you enemies. Your family could be shunned. Your father's business could suffer. Are you sure you want to take that risk?" Sarah's chin lifted with pride that would have done a queen credit. Mrs. Adelaide, I watched those men beat you in the street for the crime of asking for help. I've watched this town turn into something ugly and mean, something my grandmother wouldn't recognize. If speaking the truth costs me friends, then they weren't worth having anyway." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we go back together. All three of us. We face whatever comes, but we face it with the truth." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at these two people who'd chosen to stand with her when they could have walked away, could have protected themselves by letting her face the consequences alone. How had she gotten so lucky? How had she found such fierce loyalty in a world that seemed determined to teach her that she was alone? "All right," she said, standing and brushing the dust from her dress. "But we do this carefully. We approach the soldiers openly like people, with nothing to hide. We present our evidence calmly and let the facts speak." The three of them rode into Cedar Grove like a storm front gathering on the horizon. Adelaide flanked by Thomas and Sarah, their horses stepping in careful unison as they approached the cluster of blue uniforms that still surrounded the makeshift headquarters by the church. The crowd of townspeople had grown larger, drawn by the promise of drama and the kind of excitement that came when federal authority intersected with local grudges. Captain Morrison looked up from his paperwork as they approached, his weathered face showing the kind of professional wariness that came from years of dealing with civilians, who usually brought complications rather than solutions. He was a career soldier, Adelaide could see, the type who valued order and efficiency above all else and had little patience for the messy realities of frontier justice. "Captain Morrison," Thomas said, dismounting and approaching the table with the respectful bearing of a man who understood military hierarchy. "I believe you have some questions about my ranch and my house guest." The captain's eyes fixed on Adelaide as she dismounted more slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She wore her best dress and had braided her hair with the kind of precision that spoke of respectability rather than desperation. But she knew how she must appear to him. Exactly the type of woman who might be hiding something, exactly the kind of person who attracted trouble. "Mrs. Adelaide Garrett," Captain Morrison said, consulting his notes, "also known as Adelaide Blackwood, Adelaide Morrison, and several other aliases, according to Mr. Davis here." Adelaide felt her heart skip. Aliases. She'd never used any name, but her own, had never even considered the need for deception. "I'm sorry, Captain, but there's been some mistake. I've never used any name but Adelaide Garrett. Before my marriage, I was Adelaide Mitchell of Independence, Missouri." Bart Davis stepped forward from the crowd, his face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that came from being questioned about his previous testimony. "Don't listen to her lies, Captain. She's as slippery as a snake, that one. Told me herself she'd been using different names to avoid the law." "When?" Adelaide asked sharply, turning to face her accuser directly. "When exactly did I tell you this, Mr. Davis? We've spoken perhaps 3 times in the years since I came to this town, and each time you made it clear you wanted nothing to do with me." Bart's flush deepened, but his voice remained steady. "Private conversations they were, times when you thought no one else was listening." "What times?" Sarah stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. "Be specific, Mr. Davis. When and where did these private conversations take place?" The captain looked at Sarah with surprise, clearly not expecting a woman her age to insert herself into military proceedings. "Miss, this is official business. Perhaps I should tell the truth before an innocent woman gets hanged for crimes she didn't commit," Sarah interrupted, her chin lifted with determination that would have been admirable if it weren't so dangerous. "Captain Morrison, Mr. Davis has been lying to you, and I can prove it." A ripple of shock went through the gathered crowd. In a community where Bart Davis was considered a pillar of respectability, the accusation carried the weight of heresy. But Sarah pressed on, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a small object that glinted in the afternoon sun. "You told the captain that Mrs. Adelaide tried to sell you this locket," Sarah said, holding up the piece of jewelry for all to see. "You claimed it belonged to the wife of the officer she supposedly killed." Captain Morrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "That's correct. Mr. Davis provided it as evidence of the suspect's guilt." "Then perhaps you can explain," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, "why this locket bears the initials E.M. for Elizabeth Mitchell, my grandmother's name, rather than whatever initials the dead officer's wife would have carried." The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. Adelaide watched Bart's face cycle through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally something that might have been fear. That's not the same locket," Bart stammered. "She must have switched them somehow." "When?" Thomas asked, his voice deadly quiet. "When could she have switched them? You gave that locket to the captain an hour ago, and Mrs. Adelaide has been with me the entire time." Captain Morrison held out his hand, and Sarah placed the locket in his palm. He examined it carefully, turning it over to study the engraving on the back. "These initials are old," he said slowly, "worn deep by years of handling. This piece has been in someone's family for decades." "My family," Sarah said firmly. "My mother lost it 3 months ago in town. We searched everywhere for it, asked everyone if they'd seen it. Mr. Davis claimed he knew nothing about it then." Adelaide watched the captain's expression shift as the implications became clear. A man who'd been ready to arrest her based on Bart's testimony was now facing the possibility that his key witness had manufactured evidence to support false accusations. "Mr. Davis," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men straighten their spines, "I think you need to explain how you came to possess a locket that belongs to this young lady's family." Bart's eyes darted around the crowd, looking for support that was noticeably absent. Even his usual allies seemed to be stepping back, distancing themselves from what was rapidly becoming a scandal rather than a triumph of civic duty. I found it," Bart said finally. "Found it in the street months ago. I thought, when I heard about the reward, about the description of the stolen property, I thought it might be connected." "You thought wrong," Adelaide said, her voice steady despite the anger that burned in her chest. "And even if the locket had been connected to whatever crime you think I committed, that still wouldn't explain how you claim to have had private conversations with me about my supposed aliases and confessions." Captain Morrison set the locket carefully on the table and opened a leather portfolio, withdrawing several official documents. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, "I need you to understand the seriousness of the situation. We're investigating the murder of Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, killed during an attempted theft of military payroll. The perpetrator was described as a woman matching your general appearance, operating under multiple identities." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. Murder. They weren't just looking for a thief or deserter. They were hunting a killer. "Captain, I swear to you on my husband's grave, I've never killed anyone. I've never stolen military property. I've never even seen a military payroll." "Can you account for your whereabouts 3 months ago? Mid-March, specifically?" Adelaide's mind raced. 3 months ago, she'd been fighting to keep her farm, struggling with debt collectors and bank officials, while Samuel's medical bills ate away at what little savings they'd managed to accumulate. "I was at home trying to save my farm. My husband had just died, and I was dealing with creditors, and can anyone verify that?" The question hung in the air like a noose. Who could verify her whereabouts during those dark weeks when she'd been too proud to ask for help and too poor to hire assistance? She'd been alone with her grief and her mounting debts, isolated by her own stubborn refusal to burden others with her problems. "I can," a voice said from the crowd. All eyes turned to see Clara Sutton stepping forward, her usually quiet demeanor replaced by something approaching defiance. Adelaide stared at her in shock. Clara, who'd been Mary's friend, who'd watched the beating in town without intervening, who'd avoided eye contact whenever their paths crossed. "Mrs. Sutton," Captain Morrison said politely, "you know this woman?" "I do." Clara's voice was steady, though Adelaide could see the cost of this public testimony in the tightness around her eyes. "Adelaide Garrett came to my house 3 times in March, asking for advice about dealing with the bank. She was trying to save her farm, trying to understand the legal documents they were forcing her to sign." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. She remembered those visits, remembered Clara's kindness in explaining the complicated legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. But she'd assumed Clara had forgotten, had written her off along with the rest of the town. "What dates, specifically?" the captain asked. "March 15th, March 22nd, and March 29th, Clara said without hesitation. The last visit was the day before the bank foreclosure became final. She was in a terrible state, but she wasn't thinking about crime or revenge. She was thinking about how to survive. Captain Morrison made notes, then consulted one of his documents. The murder of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison occurred on March 27th. "Mrs. Sutton, are you certain about these dates?" "Positive. My late husband's birthday was March 29th, and Mrs. Adelaide's visit that day." "Well, it was the anniversary of Robert's death, and we talked about loss, about how grief can make you feel like you're drowning." Adelaide closed her eyes, remembering that conversation. Clara had made tea and spoken gently about the ways sorrow could overwhelm rational thought, about the importance of taking each day as it came rather than trying to solve everything at once. It had been one of the few moments of genuine compassion she'd received during those terrible weeks. "So Mrs. Garrett was in your home on the 29th, Captain Morrison said slowly. 2 days after the murder she's accused of committing." "Yes, and she was clearly in no condition to have travelled anywhere. She was exhausted, barely eating, wearing the same dress she'd worn to her husband's funeral because it was the only decent thing she owned." Bart Davis made a sound of protest. "That doesn't prove anything." "She could have—" "Mr. Davis," Captain Morrison interrupted, his voice sharp with growing irritation, "I think you've provided quite enough testimony for 1 day. In fact, I think you and I need to have a private conversation about the penalties for providing false evidence to federal investigators." The color drained from Bart's face as the implications sank in. Lying to soldiers wasn't the same as spreading gossip in town. It was a federal crime that could land him in prison, or worse. Adelaide watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. After months of being treated as guilty until proven innocent, it felt surreal to see the truth finally emerging into the light. But she knew better than to celebrate yet. Too much could still go wrong. Captain Morrison gathered his papers and stood, his bearing formal and official. "Mrs. Garrett, based on the testimony I've heard today and the evidence of Mr. Davis's false accusations, I'm satisfied that you are not the woman we're seeking. You're free to go." The words washed over Adelaide like cool water after a drought. Free, she was free, cleared of charges she'd never understood, released from the shadow of crimes she'd never committed. But even as relief flooded through her, she could see the faces in the crowd, could read the disappointment and anger of people who'd been looking forward to seeing her dragged away in chains. "However," the captain continued, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "I want to make something very clear to everyone present. Any person who provides false information to federal investigators, who manufactures evidence, or who attempts to use military authority to settle personal grievances will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." His gaze fixed on Bart Davis with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. Mr. Davis, you and I will be having a very detailed conversation about your sources and your methods. I suggest you think carefully about what you want to say." Adelaide felt Thomas's hand settle gently on her shoulder, offering silent support. As they watched Bart being led away by two soldiers, the crowd began to disperse, their excitement deflated by the anticlimactic resolution of drama they'd hoped would provide weeks of gossip. But Adelaide knew this wasn't really an ending. It was just a pause, a moment of respite before the next storm. The town's opinion of her hadn't changed, even if the federal charges had been dropped. If anything, her public vindication might make some people angrier, more determined to find other ways to drive her out. As they prepared to leave town, Adelaide caught sight of Reverend Ashford standing in the church doorway, his pale eyes fixed on her with an expression that promised this victory would be temporary at best. The war wasn't over. It was just moving to different ground. The knock came at dawn 3 days later, sharp and insistent against the cabin door. Adelaide jerked awake from uneasy sleep, her heart hammering as memories of soldiers and accusations flooded back. But when Thomas opened the door, it wasn't federal troops standing on the porch. It was Mayor Hutchins, flanked by 2 members of the town council and looking like a man who'd drawn the short straw for an unpleasant duty. "Thomas," the mayor said, his voice carefully neutral, "we need to talk." Adelaide pulled on her wrapper and joined Thomas in the main room, noting how the 3 men's eyes avoided hers entirely. Their discomfort was palpable, the kind of awkwardness that came from having to deliver news no one wanted to hear. "Say your piece," Thomas said flatly, making no move to invite them inside or offer the courtesy of coffee. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat nervously. "Thomas, you know we've got nothing personal against you. Your family's been part of this community for 3 generations, but this situation, it's become untenable." "What situation is that, exactly?" "The woman." Councilman Peters spoke up, his voice carrying the kind of moral certainty that Adelaide had learned to dread. "Her presence here is causing problems." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Adelaide could see the tension gathering in his shoulders like a storm building on the horizon. "What kind of problems?" "Moral problems," Mayor Hutchins said quickly, as if he wanted to get the words out before his courage failed. "You're an unmarried man living with an unmarried woman. It sets a bad example, especially for the young people. And after all the trouble with the soldiers, all the questions about her character." "Her character was thoroughly investigated by federal authorities," Thomas interrupted. "She was cleared of all charges." "That's not the point," Councilman Peters snapped. "The point is that she's been nothing but trouble since she arrived. First the incident in town, then the business with Bart Davis and the false accusations. People are saying she's cursed. That bad luck follows her wherever she goes." Adelaide felt sick. Even vindication hadn't been enough to change their minds. If anything, her public exoneration seemed to have made them more determined to drive her away by other means. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Thomas asked, his voice deadly quiet. The third man, Councilman Wright, finally spoke up. "We're asking her to leave, voluntarily, before this situation gets any worse for everyone involved." "And if she refuses?" Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably. "Thomas, you know how these things work. There are ways of making life difficult for people who won't listen to reason. Your water rights could be challenged. Your contracts with local ranchers could be terminated. The bank could call in your loans early." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Not violence, exactly, but economic warfare designed to achieve the same result. Adelaide had seen it before, had watched other families driven from their land through the careful application of financial pressure and social isolation. "You're talking about destroying a man's livelihood," Thomas said, "because he offered shelter to someone in need." We're talking about protecting the moral fabric of our community, Councilman Peters replied. Some things are more important than individual comfort. Adelaide stepped forward, her decision crystallizing with painful clarity. Gentlemen, you don't need to threaten Mr. Kelly. I'll leave. Adelaide? Thomas started, but she cut him off with a look. No, she said, firmly. They're right about one thing. Trouble does seem to follow me, and I won't let you pay the price for my problems. Thomas turned to face her fully, his pale eyes blazing with an anger she'd rarely seen. These men don't speak for me. This is my land, my home, my decision, about who I offer hospitality to. And if they destroy you for that decision, if they take your ranch, your livelihood, everything your family built here, what then? The question hung between them like a blade. Adelaide could see Thomas wrestling with it, torn between his protective instincts and the stark reality of what standing up to the entire community might cost him. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat again. We don't want to be unreasonable about this. We understand that Mrs. Garrett might need time to make arrangements. A week should be sufficient to settle her affairs and find somewhere else to go. A week, Adelaide repeated, tasting the bitterness of it. A week to abandon the only place that had felt like home since Samuel's death, to leave behind the man who'd shown her that kindness still existed in a world gone cruel. That's generous, Councilman Wright said, as if they were offering her a gift rather than an ultimatum. Most communities wouldn't be so patient with someone who'd brought the kind of trouble you have. Adelaide looked at the three men standing in Thomas's doorway, these pillars of respectability who'd convinced themselves that destroying lives was a moral necessity. She thought about fighting, about refusing their demands and forcing them to follow through on their threats. But what would that accomplish, except Thomas's ruin? 1 week, she said quietly. I understand. The relief on their faces was almost comical. They'd expected resistance, argument, perhaps even tears. Instead, they got calm acceptance that left them unsure whether they'd won or simply been outmaneuvered. We appreciate your cooperation, Mayor Hutchins said, backing toward the door. This is really for the best, you know. Fresh start somewhere else, away from all the complications. They left quickly after that, their duty discharged and their consciences clear. Adelaide and Thomas stood in the doorway watching them. Right away, the morning sun painting their retreating figures in shades of gold and shadow. You don't have to do this, Thomas said finally. We can fight them, find a way to make it work. Adelaide turned to look at him, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way the morning light caught in his dark hair, the steadfast determination that had carried him through his own losses and somehow given him strength enough to share with her. Yes, I do, she said gently, because I love you too much to watch them destroy you for the crime of caring about me. The words hung between them like a bridge finally built across the chasm of their careful friendship. Love. She'd said it aloud at last, given voice to the feeling that had been growing between them through weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations and the slow healing of wounded hearts. Thomas stepped closer, his hands reaching up to frame her face with the kind of gentle precision she'd come to associate with all his gestures. Adelaide. I know, she whispered. I know you feel it too. But that doesn't change what needs to happen. Then come with me, Thomas said suddenly, his voice urgent with newfound possibility. If they're going to drive you out anyway, if staying here means losing everything we've built together, then let's leave together. Find somewhere new, somewhere we can start over without their judgment and their threats. Adelaide stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. To abandon his family's land, his life's work, everything he'd built in this place, just to stay with her. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for, more than she'd thought herself. worthy of receiving it. Thomas, you can't. This ranch, this land, it's who you are. It's your whole life. No, he said firmly, my life is wherever you are. Everything else is just property, just things that can be replaced. But you... He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You can't be replaced. Not ever. Adelaide felt tears slide down her cheeks as the impossible decision crystallized before her. Stay and fight an unwinnable battle that would destroy them both, or leave together and build something new from the ashes of what they were, losing. Where would we go? She asked, hardly daring to believe they might actually have a choice. West, Thomas said without hesitation. California maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere the drought hasn't reached, somewhere people don't know our names or our history, somewhere we can just be Thomas and Adelaide, starting fresh. Adelaide closed her eyes, imagining it, a place where she wasn't the woman who'd been beaten in the street for asking for help, where Thomas wasn't the hermit who'd withdrawn from society after his wife's death. A place where they could write their own story without the weight of other people's judgments. It won't be easy, she said. We'll have nothing but what we can carry. We'll have each other. That's more than most people get. Adelaide opened her eyes to find Thomas watching her with an expression that held all the hope and fear and desperate love that had been building between them through the long weeks of healing. Here was a man willing to give up everything he'd known for the chance to build something better with her. How could she be anything but grateful for such a gift? All right, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. We'll go together. We'll find somewhere new and start over. Thomas kissed her then, gentle and sure and full of promises about the future they'd build together. And for the first time since Samuel's death, Adelaide allowed herself to believe that perhaps happy endings were possible after all, even for people like them who'd learned too much about the world's capacity for cruelty. They had 6 days to prepare for exile, 6 days to turn their backs on everything they'd known and choose love over safety, hope over resignation. It would have to be enough. The wagon wheels turned steady rhythms against the rutted trail, carrying Thomas and Adelaide westward through country that grew greener with each passing mile. 3 weeks out from Cedar Grove, the drought-scorched plains had given way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and clear streams that ran year-round. Here the grass grew thick and sweet, cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and the air carried the promise of rain rather than the bitter taste of dust. Adelaide sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, watching the landscape unfold before them with a sense of wonder that grew stronger each day. She'd forgotten that the world could be this green, this alive, this generous with its gifts. After so many years of struggling against barren earth and empty skies, the abundance felt almost magical. There, Thomas said, pointing toward a valley that opened up below them like a cupped hand holding precious water. That's it. That's the place. Adelaide followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The valley spread wide and welcoming, bisected by a creek that sparkled silver in the afternoon sun. The land rolled gently from the water's edge up to wooded hills that promised timber for building and game for hunting. Rich grass covered the valley floor, and she could see the ruins of an old homestead near the creek, evidence that someone had tried to make a life here before and failed, leaving opportunity for those brave enough to try again. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "How did you find it?" "Fellow in the last town told me about it. Said the previous owner gave up after his wife died in childbirth, couldn't bear to stay in a place that held so many memories of what he'd lost." Thomas's voice carried understanding, born of his own experience with grief's geography. "Been empty for 2 years now, but the land's still good, still waiting for someone to love it properly." They made their way down into the valley as the sun sank lower toward the western hills. The wagon tracks were faint but still visible, leading to the remains of what had once been a modest but well-built cabin. The roof had partially collapsed, and weeds grew thick around the foundation, but the stone chimney stood solid, and the log walls showed the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of hope and permanence. Thomas brought the wagon to a halt near the old cabin and climbed down, offering Adelaide his hand as she joined him in surveying their new home. The silence was profound after weeks of travel, broken only by the whisper of wind through grass and the distant call of a hawk circling high overhead. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, though she could hear the uncertainty beneath his confident tone. He'd given up everything he'd known to bring them here, burned bridges that could never be rebuilt, and now the weight of that decision showed in the careful way he watched her face. Adelaide walked slowly around the ruins, seeing not what was broken, but what could be repaired, not what was lost, but what could be built. The foundation was solid. The well still drew clear water, and the land itself called to something deep in her soul that had been silent too long. "I think," she said finally, turning to face him with a smile that felt like sunrise after the longest night, "I think we're home." The work began the next morning and continued from dawn to dusk through the weeks that followed. Thomas proved as skilled with hammer and saw as he was with cattle and horses, rebuilding the cabin's roof and walls with the kind of methodical patience that transformed chaos into order, one board at a time. Adelaide threw herself into the work of reclaiming the land around their home, pulling weeds and planting the seeds they'd bought in the last town, coaxing vegetables from earth that had been waiting 2 years for someone to tend it properly. They worked in comfortable partnership, falling into rhythms that felt both new and ancient. Thomas would rise before dawn to tend the small herd of cattle they'd bought with the proceeds from selling his ranch, while Adelaide started coffee and planned the day's projects. They'd work together through the morning, break for a simple lunch by the creek, then return to their tasks until the light failed and exhaustion drove them to seek rest. In the evenings they sat on the porch Thomas had built, watching stars emerge in skies unpolluted by the judgment of neighbors or the weight of old grief. They talked about practical things: which fields to fence first, where to build the barn, how to expand the garden come spring. But underneath the mundane discussions lay deeper currents of connection and contentment. "Do you miss it?" Adelaide asked one evening as they watched fireflies dance above the creek. "Cedar Grove, the ranch, the life you had there?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness he brought to all important things. "I miss the land," he said finally. "The way the light fell across those particular hills at sunset, the sound the wind made through the cottonwoods. But the rest of it—" He shook his head. "No, I don't miss the loneliness or the way grief had made that place feel like a tomb instead of a home." Adelaide nodded, understanding completely. She thought sometimes of the farm where she'd lived with Samuel, of the dreams they'd planted there along with their crops. But those memories felt distant now, like stories someone had told her about other people's lives. "I keep waiting for it to feel like we're pretending," she admitted, "like we're playing house instead of actually building a life together." "And does it?" Adelaide looked around at the valley they were slowly making their own, at the garden where her beans and squash grew straight and strong, at the cabin where lamplight spilled warm from windows Thomas had fitted with glass bought from a traveling merchant. Everything here bore the mark of their shared labor, their combined hopes, their determination to create something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pasts. "No," she said, "it feels real. It feels like the life I was meant to have all along. I just had to lose everything else to find my way to it." August brought the first real test of their new life, when Adelaide woke one morning to find blood on her nightgown and the familiar cramping that meant another pregnancy was ending before it could properly begin. She'd lost 2 babies with Samuel, and the pattern seemed to be repeating itself. despite her desperate hope that maybe this time in this place, things might be different. Thomas found her sitting by the creek an hour after dawn, still in her blood-stained gown and weeping with the kind of grief that came from losing something you'd barely dared hope for. "Adelaide!" He knelt beside her in the grass, his voice gentle with understanding. "What's wrong?" "I lost it," she whispered. "The baby. I lost another baby." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this news and all its implications. Then he pulled her close, holding her while she wept for the child that would never be, for the family that seemed destined to remain, just the two of them. "I'm sorry," she said when the tears finally subsided. "I know you wanted children, wanted a family. I know that was part of why you came here. With me." Thomas pulled back to look at her directly, his pale eyes serious. "Adelaide, listen to me. I came here because I love you, not because of the children we might have, but because of the woman you are right now, in this moment. If we never have babies, if it's just us for the rest of our lives, that's enough. More than enough." Adelaide searched his face for signs of disappointment or regret, but found only the steady love that had carried them through every trial they'd faced together. "You mean that?" "I mean it with every breath in my body. We're a family, Adelaide. You and me, this land, this life we're building together. That's worth more than all the children in the world." She cried again then, but these were different. Tears of relief and gratitude, and the kind of love that transcended disappointment. Thomas held her by the creek while the sun climbed higher and the day's work waited, giving her space to grieve and heal and slowly accept that perhaps happiness didn't always look the way you expected it to. By September, the cabin was finished, and the garden was producing more vegetables than they could eat. Adelaide spent her days canning and preserving, filling the root cellar Thomas had dug with stores for the winter ahead. They'd acquired chickens from a neighbor 10 miles south, and the constant activity of the small flock gave their homestead the feeling of a proper farm. "We need a name," Adelaide said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the western hills in shades of gold and crimson. "A name for what?" "For this place. For our home. Every proper ranch has a name." Thomas considered this, his gaze moving from the creek to the hills to the cabin where smoke rose straight up from their chimney. "What did you have in mind?" Adelaide had been thinking about this for weeks, turning possibilities over in her mind like stones polished smooth by water. "Sanctuary," she said finally. "Sanctuary Valley, because that's what this place is, a sanctuary from everything that tried to break us." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that still made Adelaide's heart skip. After months of marriage. "Sanctuary Valley," he repeated, tasting the words. "I like it, it fits." They were married in October by a traveling preacher who stopped by on his circuit through the scattered homesteads. No church, no witnesses, except the neighbor who'd sold them the chickens. No fancy dress or elaborate celebration. Just two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen to bind their lives together with the simple words that made their love legal in the eyes of God and man. Adelaide wore her best dress, the one she'd mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric, and Thomas had borrowed a suit from their neighbor that was too big in the shoulders and too short in the arms. But when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, when Thomas kissed her with all the tenderness and promise she'd never thought she'd know again, Adelaide felt more beautiful than any bride in silk and pearls. That night they lay in the bed Thomas had built with his own hands, listening to the creek whisper past their door and the wind sing through the trees on the hills above. Adelaide rested her head on Thomas's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Are you happy?" she asked, the question barely audible in the darkness. Happier than I ever thought I had a right to be, Thomas replied, his fingers combing gently through her hair. Are you? Adelaide considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her life as Mrs. Thomas Kelly, wife and homesteader and partner, in building something lasting from the ashes of old sorrows. Outside their window, Sanctuary Valley slept under stars that shone brighter than any she'd seen in the east. Inside their cabin, warmth and love and the promise of countless tomorrows stretched ahead. Like a gift she was still learning to believe she deserved. Yes, she whispered, I'm happy. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the word felt not like a lie or a hope or a desperate wish, but like simple truth. They'd found their sanctuary at last, and it was enough. The rider appeared on the eastern ridge, just as Adelaide was hanging laundry on the line Thomas had strung between two oak trees. 8 months had passed since they'd settled in Sanctuary Valley, 8 months of building and planting and slowly learning to trust in their happiness. The sight of a stranger approaching their homestead sent a familiar chill down Adelaide's spine, muscle memory from the days when unexpected visitors brought nothing but trouble. Thomas, she called, her voice carrying across the yard to where he was repairing a section of fence that the cattle had damaged in their eagerness to reach the sweet grass beyond. He looked up, following her gaze to the lone horseman picking his way carefully down the slope toward their cabin. Thomas set down his tools and walked to Adelaide's side, his hand settling naturally on the small of her back in the protective gesture that had become second nature between them. The rider was young, perhaps 16 or 17, with the kind of earnest face that spoke of good intentions and nervous energy. As he drew closer, Adelaide recognized something familiar in his features. The set of his jaw, the color of his hair, the way he held his shoulders. "Mrs. Adelaide," the boy called out as he reined in his horse near their porch. "Mrs. Adelaide Kelly?" "Yes," she replied cautiously, noting how he'd used her married name rather than the Garrett she'd been known by in Cedar Grove. "Or what can I do for you?" The boy dismounted with the awkward grace of youth, removing his hat to reveal hair the same honey color as Sarah Monroe's. "I'm Billy Monroe, Sarah's brother. She sent me to find you." Adelaide felt Thomas tense beside her. Any message that had traveled this far from their old life was unlikely to bring good news. "Is Sarah all right?" "Yes, ma'am, she's fine. Better than fine, actually." Billy's face split into a grin that transformed his serious features. "She's getting married next month to the new schoolteacher, and she wanted to invite you to the wedding." Adelaide stared at the boy, struggling to process what he'd said. An invitation to a wedding from someone who'd risked her own reputation to defend Adelaide against false accusations, who'd stood up to the entire town council when it would have been easier to stay silent. "I don't understand," Adelaide said slowly. "How did she even know where to find us?" Billy shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the story he had to tell. "There's been changes in Cedar Grove since you left. Big changes. After what happened with Bart Davis, after the soldiers proved he'd been lying about you, well, folks started looking at things differently." Thomas stepped forward, his voice carefully neutral. "What kind of changes?" "Bart got arrested by the federal marshals. Turns out he wasn't just lying about Mrs. Adelaide. He'd been stealing from the grain cooperative for years, skimming money and blaming the shortfalls on poor harvests and market fluctuations. When the soldiers started digging into his background, they found all sorts of irregularities." Adelaide sank onto the porch step, overwhelmed by this revelation. Bart Davis, the pillar of respectability who tried to frame her for murder, had been the real criminal all along. The irony was so complete it felt like something from a morality tale. "And Reverend Ashford?" Thomas asked. "What happened to him?" Billy's expression darkened. That's where the real changes started. Turns out a lot of folks had been having doubts about the Reverend for a while. The way he preached more about judgment than mercy. The way he turned people against each other instead of bringing them together. But it was what happened after you left that really opened people's eyes. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. Old Mrs. Patterson. You remember her, Mrs. Adelaide, the widow who lived in the little house behind the church? Well, she got sick this past winter, real sick, and she went to Reverend Ashford for help, asked if the church could spare a little food, maybe some firewood to keep her warm. Adelaide's stomach clenched with familiar dread. She could already guess how this story would end. He told her the same thing he told you, Billy continued. Said she was bringing shame on the community by begging, said a righteous woman would find another way. Only difference was Mrs. Patterson had family in the next county. Her nephew came to visit just in time to find her near dead from cold and hunger. Thomas cursed softly under his breath. And then what happened? Her nephew raised holy hell, stood up in church the next Sunday and told everyone exactly what their Christian reverend had done to a sick old woman. Asked them if this was the kind of faith they wanted to practice, the kind of community they wanted to be. Billy's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his story. It was like a dam breaking. All of a sudden people were talking about you, Mrs. Adelaide, about how they'd treated you, about how wrong it all was. Clara Sutton stood up and told everyone about the times you'd helped her when her husband was dying, how you'd brought soup and medicine without being asked. Sarah talked about watching you get beaten in the street for asking for help and how she'd been too scared to speak up. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. To think that her story had become a catalyst for change, that her suffering might have served some purpose beyond mere endurance, was almost too much to absorb. What happened to Reverend Ashford? Thomas asked. The congregation voted him out, told him they wanted a pastor who preached love instead of judgment, who understood that mercy was more important than righteousness. He left town about 3 months ago, and good riddance to him. Adelaide stood slowly, pacing to the edge of the porch as she tried to process this news. The community that had cast her out, that had judged her unworthy of basic human compassion, had apparently undergone a transformation in her absence. It was gratifying in a way, but also deeply strange. Where had this capacity for change been when she'd needed it most? So Sarah wants us to come back for her wedding, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. What else? Billy fidgeted with his hat brim, clearly building up to something more significant. Well, sir, it's not just the wedding, the town council. They wanted me to extend an official invitation for you both to return permanently. They said they'd been wrong about Mrs. Adelaide, wrong about the way they treated her, and they want to make amends. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the oak leaves and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Adelaide felt the weight of the offer settling around her like a heavy cloak, complex and laden with implications she wasn't sure she was ready to consider. What kind of amends? She asked finally. Your old farm, Mrs. Adelaide. The bank still owns it, but they're willing to sell it back at the original mortgage amount. No interest, no penalties for the foreclosure. And Mr. Kelly, they want to offer you the position of town marshal. Said they need someone with integrity, someone who understands the difference between justice and vengeance. Adelaide looked at Thomas, seeing her own confusion reflected in his pale eyes. Everything they'd lost, everything they'd been forced to abandon, was apparently being offered back to them with apologies and promises of a better future. Why now? Thomas asked the question that Adelaide hadn't dared voice. Why are they suddenly so eager to make things right? Billy's young face grew serious beyond his years. Because they learned something, I think. After you left, after Mrs. Patterson nearly died, after all the truth came out about Bart Davis, They learned that a community that doesn't take care of its most vulnerable members isn't really a community at all. It's just a collection of people living in the same place, looking out for themselves and nobody else. He paused, then added, quietly, "Sarah says to tell you that Cedar Grove needs you both, not because you need them, but because they need to become the kind of people who would never let what happened to you happen again." Adelaide walked to the edge of the yard, looking out over the valley they'd made their sanctuary. 8 months of backbreaking work had transformed this place into something beautiful. Fields green with growing crops, cattle grazing contentedly, in fenced pastures, a garden that produced more vegetables than they could eat. They'd built something here, something that was entirely their own. But more than that, they'd built it together. Every fence post and garden row bore the mark of their shared labor, their combined hopes, their determination to create beauty from the ashes of old pain. This place was theirs, in a way that the farm in Cedar Grove had never been, even when she'd held legal title to it. "Billy," she said finally, turning back to face the young messenger, "tell Sarah we're honored by her invitation, truly honored. Tell her we're grateful that the town has learned from its mistakes, and we hope they continue to grow into the kind of community that values compassion over judgment." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But also tell her that we've found our home. We've built something here that we're not willing to give up, something that belongs to us in a way that goes deeper than deeds or titles or other people's approval." Billy nodded, though she could see disappointment in his young face. "I understand, Ma'am, but Sarah wanted me to make sure you knew that you'd always be welcome, that there would always be a place for you if you ever changed your minds." "Tell her we know," Thomas said, stepping up beside Adelaide and taking her hand in his. "And tell her we wish her every happiness in her marriage. She's a good woman, your sister. She stood up for truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, and that takes real courage." Billy remounted his horse, settling into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd grown up in the country. "I'll tell her, and I'll tell the others too about what you've built here. Maybe it'll help them understand that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to build something better for the future." He rode away as the sun sank lower toward the western hills, leaving Adelaide and Thomas alone with the echoes of old sorrows and the solid reality of present contentment. They stood together in the yard they'd cleared with their own hands, surrounded by the life they'd created through love and determination, and the stubborn refusal to let the world's cruelty have the final word. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked quietly, his thumb tracing circles across her knuckles. Adelaide considered the question seriously, weighing the satisfaction of vindication against the peace they'd found in exile, the appeal of familiar ground against the joy of territory they'd claimed entirely for themselves. "No," she said finally, leaning into Thomas's warmth as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "No regrets. We left that place as outcasts and fugitives. If we went back now, it would be as the people who'd overcome their judgment, who'd proven them wrong through our success. But we don't need their approval anymore. We don't need their acknowledgement of our worth." She gestured toward the cabin where lamplight glowed warm in the windows, toward the garden where tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, toward the pasture where their cattle grazed in peaceful contentment. "We have this," she said simply. "We have each other. And we have a life we built with our own hands, in a place where no one can take it away from us because we don't deserve it. That's worth more than all the apologies in the world." Thomas kissed the top of her head, a gesture so familiar and comforting that Adelaide wondered how she'd ever lived without it. "Mrs. Adelaide Kelly," he said softly, "I believe you've become a wise woman." Adelaide smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones like warmth from a well-tended fire. She had become wise, seasoned by sorrow and tempered by love. into something stronger than the broken woman who'd stumbled into Thomas's light all those months ago. She'd learned that home wasn't a place on a map, but a feeling you carried with you, that family wasn't blood, but choice, that healing wasn't forgetting the pain, but transforming it into something useful. They walked hand in hand toward their cabin as full darkness settled over Sanctuary Valley, ready to begin another evening of the quiet happiness they'd fought so hard to claim. Behind them, the wind whispered through the grass like a benediction, carrying away the last echoes of old hurts and leaving only the promise of tomorrow. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the darkness an answer came. Even the wildest creatures, Adelaide thought, understood the value of not being alone. She tightened her grip on Thomas's hand and stepped across the threshold of the home they'd made together, grateful beyond measure for the sanctuary they'd found in each other's hearts. The door closed softly behind them, shutting out the night and the past and all the voices that had once tried to convince them they were unworthy of love. Inside their cabin, warmth and light and the simple blessing of being truly known waited to welcome them home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.